On the 17th of May, in a quiet arrondissement of Paris, not far from the Musée Marmottan Monet, a woman known as Nadia Alfassi applied a final, delicate brushstroke of cobalt blue to a small watercolor painting of the Seine. To any observer peering into her sunlit studio apartment, she was the epitome of a reclusive artist. Books on Impressionism and Islamic art stacked neatly on her shelves, the scent of turpentine and brewed coffee hanging in the air, and a placid gray cat asleep on a worn velvet armchair. Her movements were measured, her focus absolute. Yet the woman was not an artist. The apartment was not her home, and her name was not Nadia. She was an operative of a clandestine unit within Mossad, and her 3 years of meticulously constructed existence as a moderately successful painter were merely the stagecraft for the singular, silent task that had consumed her life, the unwavering observation of a man named Ghassan al-Jamil, a man she had been tasked to follow to the very gates of hell if necessary, without ever speaking a single word to him. The cobalt blue pigment she used was not chosen for its aesthetic qualities alone. It contained a unique, non-radioactive isotopic marker, imperceptible to the naked eye, but brightly visible to a specific satellite-based spectroscopic sensor, a detail that transformed her mundane artwork into a potential tracking beacon should it ever be acquired by her target. The problem that necessitated the creation of Nadia Alfassi was Ghassan al-Jamil himself, a figure who had become a phantom menace to Western and Israeli intelligence agencies for nearly a decade. Al-Jamil was not a frontline commander or a charismatic ideologue. He was something far more dangerous, a logistical and financial genius. A former professor of economics at a prestigious university in Damascus, he had vanished from public life following the death of his son in a regional conflict, only to re-emerge as the architect of a sprawling, sophisticated financial network that fueled the operations of one of the world's most lethal terrorist organizations. He was known within the intelligence community as the Treasurer. His genius lay in his ability to braid together disparate and seemingly untraceable methods of moving money. He combined ancient Hawala systems, trust-based money transfers that left no paper trail, with the hyper-modern world of cryptocurrency tumblers and the staid, respectable veneer of the international art market. He could move millions of dollars across continents to fund an attack with the same ease and invisibility that a breeze moves leaves across a courtyard. Previous attempts to disrupt his network had been catastrophic failures. Electronic surveillance proved fruitless, as al-Jamil practiced impeccable digital hygiene, communicating through multi-layered encryption on single-use devices, or more often, not communicating electronically at all, preferring face-to-face meetings in public spaces where surveillance was difficult. Attempts to infiltrate his network with human assets had resulted in the gruesome discovery of 3 different agents, their covers blown by al-Jamil's extreme paranoia and his almost preternatural ability to sense deception. The stakes were astronomical. Intelligence intercepts suggested al-Jamil was in the final stages of financing a series of coordinated, mass casualty attacks across Europe. But the specific targets, timing, and methods remained locked away inside his mind. He was a single point of failure for the entire terror apparatus, and yet, he was utterly untouchable by conventional means. A comprehensive psychological and operational profile of Ghassan al-Jamil was assembled at Mossad's headquarters in Tel Aviv, a document that grew to be hundreds of pages long and became the foundational text for the operation that would eventually be codenamed Silent Echo. The profile painted a picture of a man driven by a cold, intellectual fury, rather than fervent religious zealotry. His radicalization was rooted in a profound personal grief that had metastasized into a systemic, ideological war against the West. He viewed finance not as a tool for personal enrichment, but as the ultimate weapon of asymmetric warfare. He was disciplined to the point of asceticism, eschewing luxury, maintaining a Spartan lifestyle that made him difficult to track through spending patterns. His only indulgence, the one crack in his otherwise impenetrable armor, was a genuine and deeply knowledgeable passion for 17th century Islamic art and calligraphy. This was not a mere hobby. It was an intellectual and aesthetic pursuit that mirrored the precision and complexity of his financial dealings. He was known to attend exclusive private auctions and visit specialized galleries in Paris, Rome, and Geneva, not as a conspicuous buyer, but as a quiet, scholarly observer. He moved between these cities using a series of expertly forged passports from neutral countries, changing his identity and appearance with subtle but effective alterations. He never stayed in one place for more than a few weeks, never established a routine, and never used commercial hotels, preferring short-term rentals secured through encrypted third-party services paid for with cryptocurrency. He was a ghost who enjoyed fine art, a logistical mastermind who lived like a monk, and a man whose personal discipline made him a fortress against standard intelligence-gathering techniques. The challenge was not simply to find him, but to understand his patterns, to map his network, and to create an opportunity for neutralization without triggering a dead man's switch that could unleash the attacks he had already set in motion. The audacious solution, proposed by a veteran case officer named Silas from the Caesarea department, was born of the failures of the past. He argued that every attempt to get close to Al-Jamil had failed because the assets were trying to penetrate his operational circle. The new plan was to do the opposite, to create an asset who would exist entirely on the periphery, a fixed point of silent observation in a world Al-Jamil frequented. This asset would never attempt contact, never speak to him, and never enter his circle of trust. Their sole function would be to observe, to report, and to become such a mundane part of the background scenery that they would become invisible. The plan was codenamed Silent Echo because the operative was to be a mere reflection, a passive receiver of Al-Jamil's presence. The target environment was the high-end European art scene. The operative would be a woman, as a lone female academic or artist would attract far less suspicion in that world than a man. She would need a cover identity, or legend, that was not just plausible but perfect, able to withstand the deepest scrutiny. The operational obstacles were immense. The linguistic and cultural barriers were significant. The operative would need to be fluent in French, Italian, and German, with a flawless accent and a deep, nuanced understanding of European cultural etiquette. The technical challenges involved creating communication systems that were entirely passive and undetectable. The risk of exposure was constant, and the consequences of failure were not just the loss of an agent, but the potential acceleration of Al-Jamil's attack timeline if he sensed he was being hunted in a new and unusual way. The plan was high-risk, resource-intensive, and would require years of commitment with no guarantee of success. It was approved for one reason. Every other option had been exhausted. The selection and preparation of the operative for Silent Echo was perhaps the most critical phase of the entire undertaking. The psychological profile for the ideal candidate was demanding. They needed the patience of a scholar, the discipline of a soldier, the observational skills of a naturalist, and a profound capacity for long-term isolation. They found her in a signals intelligence unit, an analyst in her late 20s, whose file noted her as exceptionally intelligent, introverted, and fluent in 3 European languages from her upbringing as the child of diplomats. Her name was Ilara, and her service record was impeccable, but it was a detail from her confidential psychological evaluation that caught Silas's attention. A deep-seated, controlled rage stemming from the loss of her younger brother in a bus bombing in Jerusalem a decade prior, an attack that was later traced back to funds moved by Al-Jamil's nascent network. Her motivation would not be patriotism. It would be a cold, personal, and enduring grief. Her transformation from analyst to deep-cover field operative was a grueling 2-year process. She spent 6 months in an intensive art history program, not a sham course but a legitimate, graduate-level immersion into the specifics of Islamic geometric art and European painting, taught by a retired professor who was a paid consultant for the agency. She learned to paint, not just competently, but with a unique and recognizable style. Her physical training focused not on combat, but on the art of unobtrusive movement, of blending into a crowd, of sitting in a cafe for 6 hours without drawing a single glance. She was trained in micro-expression analysis, in reading the subtle cues of body language from a distance, and in the advanced techniques of passive surveillance, using reflections in shop windows, adjusting her pace to match the ambient rhythm of a street, and memorizing the faces of everyone in a room without appearing to scan it. Her psychological conditioning was the most intense part of the regimen, designed to compartmentalize her true identity from her cover and to prepare her for the crushing loneliness of the mission. Silas, her handler, was her only point of contact, his voice a calm, steady presence in weekly encrypted audio-only sessions designed to reinforce her legend and analyze her mental state. She was systematically stripped of Alara and rebuilt as Nadia Alfassi, the quiet art historian with a tragic, fabricated backstory of her own, a family lost in the Lebanese Civil War, to explain her solitary existence. The construction of Nadia Alfassi's legend was a masterpiece of operational tradecraft, a deep dive into the creation of a person who never was. The agency's technical specialists began by building a digital footprint that stretched back 15 years. They created a birth certificate in Beirut, hospital records, and school transcripts from a French lycée that had been destroyed during the war, making the documents difficult but not impossible to verify. They populated social media with ghost accounts of fictitious childhood friends who would occasionally post old, artificially aged photographs of Nadia at birthday parties or school events. A university record was created at the Sorbonne, complete with a submitted and graded thesis on the use of lapis lazuli in Persian miniatures. Financial history was established through a carefully managed inheritance from a non-existent distant relative in Canada, channeled through a series of offshore accounts before landing in a legitimate Parisian bank. This provided Nadia with a modest but independent income, enough to justify her lifestyle without raising red flags. Her apartment in Paris was chosen for its specific sightlines and its location within a community of artists and academics, providing her with a natural camouflage. The details were granular and obsessive. The books on her shelves were purchased from second-hand shops over the course of a year, some containing handwritten margin notes in her own script. Her cat, a crucial prop, was adopted from a local shelter, its veterinary records adding another layer of authenticity to her presence in the neighborhood. Even the wear patterns on her shoes were intentionally scuffed to match the walking habits of a Parisian who favored museums and parks. Every single object in her life, from the brand of tea in her cupboard to the half-finished canvases stacked against the wall, was a carefully chosen piece of a mosaic designed to convince not just a casual observer, but a deeply paranoid and intelligent adversary that Nadia Alfassi was exactly who she claimed to be. The technological and tactical support for the operation was equally meticulous and bespoke. Since Nadia could never make active transmissions, her communication with Silas was entirely passive. Her apartment was swept for bugs weekly by a cleaner team posing as municipal utility workers. But the real innovation was in her reporting method. Once a week, she would visit a specific public library and use a terminal to browse the digital art archives. Her search queries, long, complex strings of keywords and artist names, were not random. They were a coded language. The sequence of artists, the specific dates of paintings, and the catalog numbers she accessed would, when decrypted by an algorithm back in Tel Aviv, form a detailed report of her week's observations. To receive instructions, Silas would use a different method. A seemingly ordinary financial news podcast, updated daily, contained his messages. Embedded within the last 30 seconds of stock market analysis was a compressed data burst, audible only as a faint, almost imperceptible static hiss. When Nadia played this podcast on her laptop, a custom piece of software, disguised as a standard media player, would decode the hiss into a text message that would flash on her screen for 5 seconds before permanently deleting itself. Her surveillance equipment was similarly discreet. A pair of eyeglasses contained a high-resolution camera in the frame, activated by a subtle sequence of taps on the temple arm. A simple-looking fountain pen was a directional microphone, capable of capturing conversations from 15 meters away. The most crucial piece of technology, however, was what the technical division called the Tagint. This was a family of specialized chemical and particulate markers, like the isotope in her cobalt paint. Another version was a fine, aerosolized dust with a unique molecular signature, contained in a device that looked like an asthma inhaler. If she ever got close enough to one of Al Jamil's known associates, a quick, surreptitious puff in their vicinity would coat their clothing with a marker that could be detected by specialized sensors positioned at airports and train stations, allowing the agency to map the travel patterns of his entire network without them ever knowing they had been tagged. Nadia's insertion into Paris marked the true beginning of the operation's active phase. She arrived on a train from Brussels, carrying 2 suitcases and a portfolio of her artwork, a quiet woman moving to the city of her supposed alma mater. The first 6 months were dedicated solely to establishing her cover. She followed a routine that was intentionally boring and predictable. She visited the same bakery every morning, the same park in the afternoon. She set up her easel along the Seine, painting alongside other artists. Her work good, but not so brilliant as to attract unwanted attention. She submitted pieces to small, local galleries, receiving polite rejection letters that she carefully filed away, further bolstering her legend as a struggling artist. During this time, she made no attempt to find Al-Jamil. Her task was to become part of the city's fabric. She was under constant covert surveillance herself by a separate Mossad team, who monitored her for any deviations from her established patterns, any sign of emotional distress that could compromise the mission. Silas's voice through the encrypted podcast was her only tether to her real life, a disembodied guide who coached her, tested her knowledge of her own fabricated past, and provided the psychological ballast she needed to endure the profound isolation. She reported her mundane activities through the library's search engine, a litany of cafe visits and museum trips that, to the analysts in Tel Aviv, was a steady drumbeat confirming that the legend was holding. It was only after 9 months, when a coded message confirmed that Al-Jamil's known associate, a Dutch art dealer named Henrik Vandermeer, was scheduled to attend a private viewing at a gallery in Le Marais, that Nadia's mission pivoted from passive existence to active, silent surveillance. The operation in motion was a slow, methodical dance of patience and precision, spanning 4 European capitals over 18 months. The first sighting occurred in Paris. Following the intelligence about Vandermeer, Nadia secured an invitation to the same private gallery viewing through a contact she had carefully cultivated, a talkative gallery assistant. At the event, she did not look for her target. Instead, she positioned herself near a sculpture, sketchbook in hand, appearing engrossed in her work. For 2 hours she sketched, her eyes only occasionally lifting to scan the room through practiced, peripheral glances. Then she saw him. Ghassan Al-Jamil was standing across the room, speaking quietly with Vandermeer. He looked different from the grainy surveillance photos in her file, thinner, with more gray in his hair, but his posture, a rigid, academic stillness, was unmistakable. She felt a cold surge, a mix of adrenaline and the icy grief that was the wellspring of her resolve. She did not stare. She continued to sketch, her hand steady, but she activated the camera in her glasses, capturing a series of high-resolution images. She noted his clothing, his watch, the way he gestured with his left hand, the slight limp in his right leg that was not in his file. Later that week, her library search query included a string of terms related to 17th-century Dutch marine painters, sculptural anatomy, and gait analysis, a coded message that delivered the first concrete intelligence of the operation. For the next 3 weeks, she shadowed him from a distance, never closer than 100 meters, mapping his movements around Paris. A visit to a specialized bookseller, a long walk through the Jardin du Luxembourg, a brief, silent meeting with an unidentified man on the Pont des Arcs. She was a ghost in his wake, a silent echo. The second city was Rome. 3 months after Paris, intelligence from a tagged associate of Vandermeer indicated that Al-Jamil was traveling to Italy. Nadia's legend had a built-in pretext for the move. She informed her gallery contacts in Paris that she was taking a sabbatical to study the works of Caravaggio and the use of chiaroscuro, a plausible step for any artist. She rented a small apartment in Trastevere, a neighborhood known for its labyrinthine streets and vibrant artisan community. Her surveillance in Rome was more challenging. Al-Jamil was even more cautious, his movements more erratic. He was frequenting businesses that were later identified as fronts for the 'Ndrangheta, the Calabrian mafia, with whom he was laundering money, trading the untraceable liquidity of the Hawala network for the solid, physical assets of European real estate. Nadia's role here shifted from simple observation to mapping a criminal ecosystem. Her artistic focus became Roman architecture, giving her a reason to spend hours in public squares, sketching facades of buildings that housed Al-Jamil's meetings. On one occasion, she sat at an outdoor cafe, sketching the Pantheon, while Al-Jamil conducted a meeting with two men less than 20 feet away. The directional microphone in her fountain pen, laid casually on the table next to her sketchbook, captured fragments of their conversation. It was mostly innocuous talk about exchange rates and property values, but one phrase, the Florentine shipment, was flagged by the analysts. It was a coded reference to a delivery of weapons. Her report, coded into a library search on Renaissance logistics and Medici family shipping manifests, provided the critical link that allowed a different intelligence unit to intercept a container of assault rifles at the port of Genoa 2 weeks later. She had drawn blood without ever raising her voice. Geneva was the third stop, the nerve center of Al-Jamil's financial empire. His trips to Switzerland were for a singular purpose: to engage with the notoriously opaque world of private banking and asset management. For Nadia, this presented a new set of operational difficulties. The environment was not one of bohemian art galleries, but of sterile corporate lobbies and exclusive, members-only clubs. Her cover as an artist was less effective here. Silas and the planning team had anticipated this. Months before, they had used her fabricated inheritance to make a small but significant investment through a Geneva-based wealth management firm. This provided Nadia, or rather, the legal entity of her cover identity, with a legitimate reason to be in the city and to request meetings within the financial district. Her new apartment overlooked the Lake Geneva waterfront, a sterile, modern flat that reflected the city's character. Her surveillance here was almost entirely technical and indirect. She identified the building where Al-Jamil used a private, unlisted office, secured under a shell corporation. She could not enter, but she could observe. From her apartment, using a telescope equipped with a spectroscopic lens, she could analyze the light spectrum from the office's windows at night, a technique that could, under specific circumstances, detect the presence of certain chemicals or electronic emissions. It yielded nothing for weeks, a frustrating and sterile exercise in patience. The breakthrough came not from technology, but from classic human observation. She noticed a courier on a motorcycle, making a delivery to the building every Tuesday at precisely 11 a.m. He always carried the same type of document satchel. On the fourth Tuesday, she accidentally spilled her coffee on the courier as he was entering a cafe after his delivery. In her flustered, profuse apologies, she managed to use her inhaler, misting his satchel with the invisible molecular tagant. The satchel was later traced to a printing house in Zurich that was producing high-quality forged passports for Al-Jamil's operatives. Another node in his network had been exposed, silently and without a trace of her involvement. The final city was Vienna, the Austrian capital, with its historical legacy as a crossroads of empires and a neutral ground for Cold War espionage, had become Al-Jamil's preferred location for his most sensitive meetings. He believed the city's ambient level of diplomatic and intelligence activity provided a form of cover, a forest where he was just another tree. By the time he arrived in Vienna, Nadia had been living her cover for almost 3 years. The lines between Alara and Nadia had begun to blur at the edges. The cold rage that had once fueled her had subsided into a kind of weary, monastic devotion to the task. Her existence was a paradox. She was surrounded by the beauty and culture of Europe's greatest cities, yet her experience of them was filtered through the narrow lens of her mission. She saw not art, but angles of surveillance. She heard not music, but the ambient noise that could mask a conversation. In Vienna, the operational tempo quickened. Intelligence suggested Al-Jamil was meeting a physicist, a rogue scientist from Pakistan, to finalize the purchase of components for a dirty bomb. The meeting was to take place at the Café Central, a historic coffee house once frequented by Trotsky and Freud. The order from Silas was stark and unambiguous. This was the endgame. Nadia was not to observe. She was to act. Her task was to deploy the Keystone device, a piece of technology so secret that she had only been briefed on its existence a week prior. It was a microtransmitter, no larger than a grain of rice, disguised as a dark inclusion within a tiny, flawed diamond set in a simple silver locket. Her instructions were to get the locket onto the person of the physicist. A separate team, a KIDON unit, was in place to use the transmitter's signal to intercept the physicist after the meeting, seize him, and acquire the final, missing intelligence on the planned attacks. The risk of failure was absolute. If Al-Jamil detected her, the entire operation, and her life, would be forfeit. The climax of Operation Silent Echo unfolded not with a bang, but with the quiet clink of a teaspoon against porcelain. On the designated day, Nadia entered the Café Central, a place she had scouted for weeks. She wore a simple dress, the silver locket around her neck. She took a small table near the entrance, ordered a coffee and a pastry, and opened a book on the secessionist art movement. Her heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm she had trained for years to control. Al-Jamil and the physicist arrived 20 minutes later, taking a secluded booth in the back. They spoke in low tones, their heads close together. Nadia did not look at them. She read her book. After 45 minutes, she paid her bill and stood to leave. This was the moment the entire operation had been built for. As she walked toward the exit, she timed her path to intercept the waiter, who was bringing the two men their second round of coffee. In a move that was a fluid, perfectly choreographed sequence of stumbles and apologies, she bumped into the waiter, jostling his tray. As he struggled to regain his balance, her left hand shot out to steady the physicist's arm, who had half risen from his seat at the commotion. In that split second of contact, her thumb pressed a hidden clasp on the locket. The chain broke, and the locket fell, not to the floor, but into the deep outer pocket of the physicist's overcoat, which was draped over the back of the booth. The move was flawless, a piece of kinetic artistry, practiced 1,000 times. She apologized profusely to the waiter and to the two men, her face a mask of embarrassed contrition. Al-Jamil gave her a brief, dismissive glance, his eyes cold and uninterested. He saw only a clumsy woman, an irrelevant piece of background noise. She hurried out of the cafe, her hands trembling slightly now that the act was done. She did not look back. She walked 2 blocks to a prearranged metro station, took a train heading north, got off 2 stops later, and descended into a different station, heading south. She was a ghost once more, disappearing back into the city. The escape and extraction were as silent and methodical as the rest of the mission. After leaving the Café Central, Nadia followed a predetermined sanitization route through Vienna, a 2-hour journey that involved multiple changes of public transport, walking through crowded shopping centers, and ducking into a cinema for 20 minutes before exiting through a side door. This was designed to detect and shake any possible surveillance. At a designated drop point, a locker in a quiet railway station, she retrieved a bag containing a new set of clothes, a wig, and a Swedish passport with a new identity. In the station's washroom, she transformed herself one last time. Nadia Alfasi, the quiet artist, ceased to exist. An anonymous Swedish tourist walked out, blended into the evening crowds, and took a train to Prague. From there, a commercial flight took her to a neutral third country, where she was met by a Mossad transport team. The entire extraction was completed in less than 12 hours. She never returned to her apartment in Vienna. A cleaner team was already there, meticulously erasing every trace of her existence, stripping the apartment bare until it was just an empty space for rent. Her paintings, her books, her cat, which was taken to a handler's home, all vanished. Meanwhile, back in Vienna, the KIDON unit tracked the Keystone transmitter. They followed the physicist from the cafe to his hotel. 2 hours later, under the cover of a staged gas leak that evacuated the building, they entered his room and took him. The intelligence he provided under interrogation was everything they had hoped for and more. It contained the complete blueprint for the planned attacks, target cities, dates, cell leaders, and the location of the radiological material. Within 48 hours, a coordinated series of raids across 6 European countries dismantled the entire network. The attacks were averted. The aftermath of Operation Silent Echo was analyzed for years within the agency, becoming a textbook case in deep cover, passive intelligence gathering. The strategic value of the intelligence she had gathered was immeasurable, credited with saving thousands of lives. The political and diplomatic repercussions were carefully managed. The raids were conducted by local European law enforcement, acting on anonymous tips, with no official credit ever taken by Israel. The operation remained a closely guarded secret. Ghassan al-Jamil, the treasurer, vanished after the Vienna meeting. Deprived of his network and his key scientific contact, he became a ghost in truth, his power broken. Intelligence suggested he was eventually killed in an internal power struggle within his own organization, a victim of the paranoia and mistrust that followed the complete collapse of his operations. For Alara, the consequences were more personal and profound. The psychological cost of living as Nadia for 3 years was immense. Debriefing and psychological reintegration took more than a year. She had to learn how to be Alara again, how to shed the quiet, artistic persona that had become a second skin. The mission had transformed her. The cold rage had been expended, replaced by a vast, quiet emptiness. She had achieved her revenge, but it was a hollow victory that had cost her a part of her own identity. She left the agency, seeking the anonymity she had once perfected as a tool of her trade. She moved to a small town on the coast, and some reports said she took up painting, for real this time, her subjects the endless, unchanging horizon of the sea. The operation raised deep moral and ethical questions within the intelligence community about the psychological toll of such deep cover assignments and the nature of an operative who becomes a living weapon of silent, patient observation. Was Alara's complete sacrifice of her identity a justifiable price for the lives she saved? And in a world of constant digital surveillance, is the most powerful weapon of all the ability to be present yet entirely unseen? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel.